Please welcome Laura Shin, Forbes, Meltem Demirs, Digital Currency Group, Scott Mullins, Amazon Web Services, Catherine Nicholson, Block Cipher, and Eric Piscini, Deloitte.
You have to switch up.
Oh yeah, we didn't do it.
We didn't do it.
We didn't do it right.
Hi, welcome to this panel. So this panel is about moving from proof of concept to production. And as a journalist covering this space, I would say that 2015 really was the year when it felt like the financial services industry was waking up to the fact that this technology was going to remake the industry and make things more efficient and all that. And this year is really about various companies sort of racing to production. We already have one product out there, which is the Link product put out by NASDAQ in partnership with Chain. And we have several panelists here who see kind of like different aspects of that whole process, and who can talk about how it's happening, how to make it happen. And I'm sure many of you right now are wondering how to make it happen. So we have a lot of questions. We are going to dive right in. So can you each describe briefly for me in a minute or so what you do, how it relates to the process of moving a blockchain idea from proof of concept to production?
Great. Hi, I'm Meltem Demirs. I'm with a firm called Digital Currency Group. We are a company, not a fund, but one of our primary activities is investing in Bitcoin and blockchain companies. We've invested in 70 companies across 20 countries over the last 3 years, including companies like Chain, which was partnering with NASDAQ on the Link product, newer companies like Blockstream, companies like Ripple, really broad across this entire space. And really what we're focused on, what I spend my time focusing on in my particular role as our director of community, is thinking about ways to build a platform to help these companies connect with enterprises, to help them do more collaborative experimentation in a way that removes a lot of the friction that exists today, the paperwork, the contracting, the extensive negotiations. How do we make that process more efficient so that more people can engage with this technology in a real way?
So I'm Scott Mullins, and I work for a company called Amazon Web Services, where I'm responsible for business development and strategy in the financial services industry. And so we are fortunate enough to have a large number of financial services enterprises as well as blockchain providers as customers at AWS. And we spend a lot of our time talking about how to move not just blockchain workloads from POC to production, but also other workloads in the financial services industry.
I'm Catherine Nicholson. I'm CEO and co-founder of a startup called Block Cipher. We provide blockchain web services, so we are the BWS to the AWS. And we enable companies to easily build blockchain applications using our web services.
Good morning, Eric Piscini. I'm from a company you might have heard of called Deloitte. I lead the financial services blockchain activities for the firm globally. Our activities are mostly focused on three things. We spend a lot of time with our clients, coming with strategies to implement blockchain solutions, including some of the solutions we have here in the room just behind me. We also create prototypes with some of the technology partners that we have. And then finally, we go to market with our clients, and we can talk about that.
Okay, great. The other thing which I neglected to mention in the introduction, but I know several of the panelists want me to talk about, is that we think we win the diversity award because we have 3 women on the panel. Okay, so after that very important point, why don't we also talk about some kind of like something that's pretty definitive and important to understand to have the discussion, which is Catherine. Could you define each stage, proof of concept, prototype, production, and explain what you need to accomplish at each level to move to the next step?
Yep. Okay, so for institutions, for enterprises, one normally begins with a POC, which is a proof of concept. It's an area that's very unmethodological in terms of engineering. It's something where you're trying to iterate quickly, fail quickly. It's the mantra of 10 engineers doing 10 projects in 2 months and seeing what is sticky. There is very, very little design. Fundamentally, you're just trying to see what sort of use cases are possible. The next stage that you move on to is what's called a pilot phase. What's very important is that a POC doesn't move to a pilot. As Deloitte will say over and over again, it's a completely different restart. It's a different environment. There are design considerations. They might be PSR requirements. And so you have to essentially take those use cases, but then begin to look at how would you begin to put this into production. And then finally, production is when it is out in the wild, where it has to scale. All the users have to be happy. You have to have a whole bunch of help desk requirements, but essentially it begins to run on its own.
Okay, great. So this is just, for anyone who would like to answer, what are the different departments involved in moving from an idea to a proof of concept to a prototype to a production system?
So I could start, Laura. Maybe to add to what Catherine was saying, I think one of the first things we do is actually talk to some innovation groups within organizations, and we identify where blockchain will make sense. Right? I think one of the challenges that we are facing today across industries, not only in financial services, is people are trying to fix issues with blockchain where there is sometimes nothing to fix, or we can fix it with something else. And so that's part of before we go into a POC, we most likely going to start with an assessment of where blockchain makes sense. And I think when we do that, we typically talk to business, head of business lines, innovation groups, operation groups as well. And then we go down the stack, if I can say, from a business operation to the technology groups, to the different layers of the organization to actually understand the value of the blockchain.
So this actually dovetails with
I think what we've learned from our experience in working with a lot of our corporate partners, our investors, who come to us and say, hey, there are all of these different solutions. There are so many different companies that are operating in different parts of this blockchain space. People are using Ethereum. People are using the Bitcoin blockchain. People are using a private blockchain. How do we even begin to navigate? And what I always say is there are so many innovations that are sort of coming together at the same time. This concept of blockchain is really about this idea of distributed computing that could be applied in multiple parts of the organization, not just specific to financial services. And so I always ask, well, what problem are we solving? And fundamentally, does a blockchain solution or a distributed computing solution offer something that an existing solution doesn't? So it's important to ask, what are the distinguishing factors that make a particular problem uniquely suited for this solution?
Yeah, I think part of it is there's a lot of fear of missing out in blockchain right now, and so FOMO, exactly. Investors, you know about this.
Oh, yes.
But it's not about fitting a round peg in a square hole or whatever. The opposite, maybe a square peg in a round hole. But I do think that there's a lot of that going on. And it's something where, maybe a database is just fine if you need that throughput, you need that high availability and whatnot. So it's not necessarily the comparison contrast between a database and blockchain technology. It's fundamentally what can't be done or what's breaking with the existing database that a blockchain technology would be far superior.
So I'll dovetail on what you said and then come back to Eric's comments. FOMO is nothing new in financial services or any industry. And if you go back probably 2 years or 3 years, blockchain wasn't the topic of FOMO, it was cloud.
Yes, and so indeed.
So we understand a little bit about how that works in some aspects. And so I think a lot of people, when you're starting in a POC, business owners, don't forget that if you work for an enterprise, you've got people down the chain that you need to include in that process. And so you've probably got a third-party outsourcing team. You've probably got a third-party oversight team. You've definitely got a compliance team or a risk management team. And as you consider as a business owner, I want to work with this new technology, or I want to work with this application provider, you've got to bring the rest of your team along for the ride, because what you don't want to do is get all the way down to the end of the line with your POC in relation to talking to the application provider and saying, yes, we're going to do this, it's fantastic, here's the funding, and then you have 5 people that raise their hands and say, hey, you've got to come through us and talk about the different things that we need to check the boxes on to make sure that we're doing this in a very safe and secure fashion, and we're managing the risk associated with running our business appropriately.
And I think also it is a partnership. There's the infrastructure providers, there's the consulting services providers that are experts in the various industries that they all operate. And they're the startup providers that, for the most part, all the blockchain activity is happening in startup land. And so it does take a team to bring that, and particularly from POC, and if you have the design to go into production, then you have to bring all those parties also to the table.
And I'd add one more partner. I think the investor is increasingly becoming a part of that dialogue. When you think about someone who's looked at this space for a long time, who's talking to these companies, who understands what's going on, really helping the enterprise parse through the hundreds of different service providers in this space and help them identify who they should be working with, who they could be working with, and facilitating those relationships in a new way. I think that's what I'm really passionate about in my particular role, because I do get to work with 70 different entrepreneurs and teams who are trying to build these different visions.
And don't forget the money, too.
Yes, the money, so that people can build the technology so it reaches a POC ultimately, yes.
Yeah, and to add to Scott's point about the bringing people along when you start building blockchain applications, it's not only building, bringing your own organization, it's also, and I've seen that multiple times, it's bringing the regulators with you. So when the regulators are starting to get involved early on in the process, the chance that they come back at the end and tell you, oh, this is not going to work, is minimal. So bring them along early on. The other thing to keep in mind is when we design blockchain solutions, most of the time we don't design that within one organization. By design, we design blockchain solutions across organizations. So when you bring them, you have to bring multiple parties, which is kind of a big challenge in some instances, right? In financial services where I spend most of my time, it's a pretty big challenge to try to put all those parties together. So keep that in mind. This is a big challenge.
Yeah, and another rule of thumb that's great in any POC is begin with the end in mind.
Yeah.
Know what you want to test, and I can relate this to our services. We have over 70 different services at AWS, and somebody will come and say, I want to try your data warehouse. Okay, we can do that. We can introduce you to Redshift, and you can use Redshift, but what do you want to do with Redshift? That's really what's going to be the proof of concept, is using Redshift to solve a business problem. And so I think that applies not only to cloud services, but also to blockchain use cases itself.
When we talk about bringing together all these different parts and different departments and knowing when to use a database versus use a blockchain, what are some of the obstacles and risks that we encounter along the way? And also, do you have any examples of failures of proof of concepts? That was a question from the audience. So if you could talk about that risks and obstacles and maybe illustrate it with an example.
I'm happy to start with that one. I think the blockchain fundamentally, going back to the earlier question around what makes a use case successful, how do you identify where you use a blockchain, the fundamental premise is around trust and enabling actors in a value chain or in a particular architectural construct to work together in ways where trust can be disintermediated, where trust can be made more frictionless. And so I think the organizations that are more successful in implementing blockchain solutions, implementing this technology in innovative ways that actually create value, are finding ways to create trust in a distributed manner, to eliminate or maybe to change the role of certain intermediaries and to shift the interactions they have so that there's no longer so much friction when a contract is changing hands, when an asset is changing hands. It doesn't mean that structurally the way that parties in a value chain interact will fundamentally change, but you can make that process a lot more efficient and free up valuable human resource time to focus on things other than compliance and ticking and tying and checking. So I think starting in places, looking at processes where trust is really fundamental is a great way to set your POC up for success, because that's fundamentally the innovation, from my perspective at least.
I would say that and continuing on the theme of trust, you might be trying to do something new in regards to trust, but you have to remember that you're probably working with an organization that still has very established ways of dealing with trust in relation to
in financial institutions?
Contracts, agreements, and frankly, just in managing risk. And so, to our earlier points, as you consider your POC, make sure that people understand what it is that you're trying to do, and that you can put it into terms that fit with the models of governance or compliance that your firm employs today. So if you're talking about, I want to use the blockchain, or I want to use a new database, or I want to use a new service, you've got to be able to explain to the people that are responsible ultimately for ensuring that you're managing risk appropriately at your firm or you're checking all the boxes from compliance, that they understand completely and are educated in their own terms, in their own languages, on what it is you're doing and how it fits within the governance model that you employ at your company.
Yeah. I mean, to add to that, I would say when we see proof of concept fading, the reason is most likely that because you start too big, and you start to say, I'm going to change the entire organization with blockchain, and people get scared, right away. And so my recommendation to pretty much every day to my clients is start with something very small that's going to impact a very small population within your organization or with your customers. Pilot that, learn from that experience, and then grow from there. But don't start your proof of concept by saying, I'm going to change end-to-end business processes, because you won't get there.
Yeah.
I think, Eric, it's also probably, and you would probably, somebody add some color here.
Yes.
It's also important to talk about a real business problem.
Yeah.
Don't just pick a pet project. And
Yep.
this applies, I think, to any POC, frankly. We talk about this a lot with our customers at AWS. Pick a project it's important to you. It doesn't have to be mission critical. But make sure that when you invest in a POC for this, you're not just investing to put it on the shelf and say, oh, we did that. Make sure it's actually something that applies to the business and is meaningful at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to give the perspective from a startup. We have been thrown, and this is very common, especially when you're working with large institutions, 150-page boilerplate master services agreements for a POC. And so that's a prime example of trying to boil the entire ocean, applying the same rigor of minimum control requirements, data protection, the parties that are involved, and it's way overkill for a POC. And so I think, if you're an institution and you're looking to do a POC, put that MSA on the side and listen to the startup. If you're a startup, ask the institution if they will work with your 4 to 5 page agreement instead of going through months and months of negotiations with counsel, with all the SMEs, with everything, because you're going to wind up spending half a year to a year just in the legal terms of the contract before you even get started on your proof of concept. The other thing is, I hear over and over again the request for on-premise for POCs, right? Everybody wants that, especially in finance. And I have to ask, what is the purpose, right? The reason you do a POC is to iterate quickly, fail quickly, and discover what are the interesting parts that you can do with blockchain technology. So why would you not start with SaaS? Why would you not start with cloud? It's cheaper, it's faster, and you'll discover a lot more in a shorter period of time.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add to that and to maybe do some commercials for you guys. But don't start from scratch, right? Don't think you're going to have to design your own smart contract platform. You have an amazing set of technologies available today, and make sure that you don't build something that already exists. Leverage what's available, so blockchain, smart contracts, identity layers and stuff like that. Build what's important for you on the top of it, and you're going to accelerate by doing that.
And I'll just add from the perspective of many startups, we're fortunate to be a part of AWS's Activate program, which many other venture firms, accelerators, incubators are a part of, where AWS will actually offer technical expertise to help our portfolio companies figure out what's the best way to containerize this product. What is the best way to technically architect the solution I'm building so that it can be deployed in a POC environment and then moved into a production environment where it can work across many different types of organizations so that I'm not building custom solutions each time. And I think the role that AWS has played in the startup ecosystem, they've made it really easy for someone to build a technology solution. Because of this fantastic conduit they've created, where so many startups are able to get access to these services, these insights, credits to even spin up things on AWS. So I think it's really fundamental that when we work with our entrepreneurs and they're saying, my vision is to work with the largest banks in the world, well, let's talk to other companies that are doing that and see what way do you need to build your tech stack, how do you need to build your product so that it can migrate to these different institutions and work in a compliant fashion. So it is really about making ourselves smarter, sharing this knowledge, and building in a smarter way.
So when we were talking about the obstacles, Catherine at the end, started talking specifically about some of the ones that she's seen in financial services, and I was wondering if Eric and Melton could talk a little bit about how specific industries have their own challenges, such as financial services, energy. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing there from the regulatory perspective in particular?
Yeah, sure. I think in financial services, what we see is a lot of organizations doing those proof of concept and even prototypes, but they don't think about the regulatory aspect of those prototypes when it's time to move to production. So that's where they're stuck. And that's why I was asking you earlier, when you do those prototypes, engage the regulators, because that's the best way to get your prototype up and running. In financial services, you have so many different regulations to be compliant with. Make sure you select a use case where you don't have that many regulatory agencies around you when you do that. That's why, for example, cross-border payments has been quite successful with blockchain technologies, and you have different examples, including one in the room back there. But this is because you don't have to involve that many regulators or that many regulations to actually make this happen. So that's one example in banking. You can apply that to healthcare. You can apply that to pretty much every industry.
I think the second element I would add, and what I always encourage startups in our portfolio and in the ecosystem in general to do, is go and talk to the enterprises. You have this fantastic wealth of individuals who are truly domain experts in these spaces, and they have behind them their own compliance functions. For example, one of our investors is Western Union, and we speak a lot with Western Union's team. One of the things they're bringing to the table, they know regulation and compliance inside and out. They're serving customers in 140 different countries. That is a tremendous wealth of knowledge and resources that these startups can leverage as they start building their product. So I would say don't always try to create from the outside and say, I'm going to completely overhaul this process and change it and do it a different way. I think it's much more about collaborating and bringing together the expertise of the incumbent. There's a reason these institutions have been successful. It's because they have all of the functional competencies, that are needed to operate in some really complex, highly regulated spaces. So it's really about building a partnership where you're sharing information and you're being smart about how you're building as well. If you are building for banks, you should know that you can't use every third-party service provider in your platform. There are certain service providers that are approved, right? So some individuals, some companies may not know that. So how do we enable our companies to share that knowledge so that when you get to a point where you're finally partnering with someone in a POC, 18 months after starting your first conversation, you have the right technical architecture and you don't have to go back and rebuild your entire platform. So it's really about being smarter, sharing, communicating. A lot of building is going to happen. It's much more productive when we build together and leverage the insight that each unique player has.
So Melton, do you think there's a danger though because from a startup point of view, we like to break a lot of things and then we don't like to ask for permission.
Okay.
Is there a danger of getting shoehorned into that existing process instead of actually just reinventing everything from the ground up?
Definitely. I do think there's a balance, and maybe that balance will start to tip in a year or two once the startups in the space, I think there will be a bit of a shakeout. We'll start to see some pull ahead, some maybe not being as successful. And as that starts happening, I think there will be certain startups that through their partnerships, that through their relationships have learned a lot. And they can take a step back and say, what if we reconstructed this entire process, took it apart and rebuilt it in a different way, using what we've learned through these POCs over the last X number of years.
I would add to that, though, Catherine. This is similar to the concept of shadow IT. If you recall, it's going on today still, but more so a couple of years ago, that was a very popular term. And I think if you subvert existing processes inside enterprises, and you are a shadow IT or you're a shadow blockchain project that's going to change something meaningful, I don't think you're going to find anything meaningful moving towards blockchain because you're going to be outside of the norm, outside of the governance framework. So I think it's important to work within. It's also important to educate from within. And so when you hit those roadblocks, whether it's in cloud computing or in blockchain applications, it's important to educate why this is different. A lot of people in the daily course of just anything they do are looking from a certain point of view. And I think there are certain technologies, whether that's blockchain or cloud or whatever's coming next, that allow you to look at a situation from a different point of view and see the solution a little bit differently.
Yeah, because you guys have been here, right? You had to do a lot of convincing on cloud, right?
We've been
Yes. The margins are helpful, improving your point.
Yes.
I wanted to also ask Scott and Catherine, while we're on this subject of challenges or obstacles, what the technology challenges are, from dealing with the technology itself to integration with legacy systems and also regulatory concerns.
Yeah. So there's no way around integrations. It's you never have that perfect clean environment, no matter what. You can start that way, but fundamentally you're going to have to work with other systems in order to have an enterprise-wide applications. And I think there's also that same process that you have to go through in order to do it, and that's why you have to bring the team members to the table in order to accomplish that. I think from a blockchain technology perspective, it's a wholly different animal to run, a single instance and build your proof of concept and then run one at scale. And so when you look at what the experimentation that goes on with blockchain technology, you do have to have an eye on how many users are you going to have? What's the ultimate goal that you're looking to accomplish with this? Because you can't just throw hardware, as you guys well know, at the problem of scaling a single instance. You have to make it modular. You have to break it apart. You have to opportunistically scale the individual pieces that need to apply to blockchain technology.
Yep. I think from our perspective, I think any cloud provider would tell you they would love to see an all-in migration to their cloud. We have those happening at AWS, obviously, and those are well known. Suncorp out of Australia is a well-known organization in the financial service industry that made that announcement in 2013, is in the process of doing that. But you have to understand, I think, in any kind of technological journey, it's a journey, and so you're going to have to interact with legacy systems. It's not just a light switch. You're not going to change everything in an organization. There's going to be a gradual move, and that move could be an accelerated move. It could be very fast, but it's still going to be a well-thought-out move because you are a financial services organization. So you have to plan for hybrid in some way, whether that's hybrid cloud in the cloud computing space, or if it's a hybrid type of interaction from a blockchain system interacting with a legacy database or a ledger. You have to plan for where do we want to go, and then how are we going to get there over time.
So this is a great audience question that came in from someone anonymous, which is what makes a specific market or use case ripe for proof of concept? And along with that, if you can give some examples of what industries and use cases you think are furthest along and toward production, that would be great.
So yeah, I can start. So how do you know a proof of concept is successful?
Or a market is ripe for
or the
proof
market
of
is ready
concept.
for that. Well, I think we talked about it a little bit, right? You need to find the right pain points to address. So where things are actually broken and where it makes sense for blockchain to fix those issues. So you have to do some kind of analysis to get there, right? You don't decide one day that it is gonna happen. So we have example on trade finance. A lot of us are spending time on trade finance, and that's a good example of a process that is not efficient today and can benefit from a blockchain-based solution. So that's just one example. I think you can apply that analysis to pretty much every business process where value is transferred.
I would add, and I would also say, anytime paper is changing hands, if again we go back to the concept of transferring trust and the idea that you can digitize and dematerialize physical records, if you just look at a process and you say, where is there paper changing hands? Where are there physical processes happening? Could they be digitized? Where is there a process happening that involves the transfer of trust between, it could be within your own organization. Let's say every day you're walking down to compliance to get a checkbox or to get a signature on a supply chain contract. Is that an opportunity? Probably. Could you digitize that? Probably. Now, how do you work in the audit and compliance requirements? How do you create the record trail? Maybe that's the place. So I think if you look at the processes in an organization, blockchain technology offers institutions an opportunity to step back and say, why have we constructed these processes this way? Where is the highest expense item? Why is it so expensive? Are there opportunities to use this technology to maybe do the same thing. We can keep the same process, but digitize or dematerialize the paper, remove some of the frictions. That's why I would really start looking. And that's where we see a lot of the movement happening right now with successful solutions that are being developed.
So I know it's not very popular on Wall Street in the financial industry, but really the only POC that's in production is Bitcoin. Right? It's the only open blockchain that is out in the wild, that has come under attack, that has stood the test of time. And so, everything else is a bright, shiny baby, and it's theoretical, and it's great to see these developments happen in all different shapes and forms. But let's call it what it is.
I'm so happy that you said the big bad B word. I know. Bitcoin's not always welcome.
Although, as I mentioned earlier, there is the NASDAQ Link product. Is that just because it's private? Is that why it's not as does that seem untested to you? Or it is fairly new.
Yeah, so it is very new. And private chains, so the individual parts of a blockchain aren't fundamentally new, right? Peer-to-peer, cryptography, math, all that other stuff. But the only one chain that has achieved massive consensus is Bitcoin. And so I think all of these private blockchains, it's a great way to experiment. BlockCypher, we run our own private chain because it's a really nice development environment, so developers can run automated testing, imagine that, on something that's more tenable to test on than, for example, Bitcoin Test. So they have their purpose, but they're unproven, right? They have to go to take that next step in order for them to even begin to see what are the problems that can arise.
So can you just tell me overall what you think the difference is in relative maturity between what institutions are doing, primarily around private blockchains, versus what startups are doing, and many of them are building on open chains?
Yeah, so many of the startups are using our web services, and it's very bifurcated, right? Startups are for the most part building on Bitcoin, and now Ethereum is coming into production, hopefully soon. So that there's a lot of development that's going on there. And the other side is institutions are largely building private chains. So it's very different.
All right, and so we're coming up toward the end, so I just have a few quick questions I want to get to, but there's one from Meltem, which is how can an investor determine when to invest and which startups can make the technology real?
That's a great question. I think the one thing we've certainly learned through the last 3 years, certainly the last sort of wave of blockchain innovation. It's important to remember that a year ago, sitting in this room, first of all, no one would have been in this room because no one would have really been talking about blockchain, and we didn't have the amount of interest that we've had even in the last 6 months, right? Things have just evolved really quickly. For us, the biggest thing is really identifying people who understand the value of partnerships and relationships. This is all about, it's not enough to have technology. It's not enough to have a product. You have to be able to work with an institution, with an enterprise, to help them use that technology to unleash value in some new way. And it's really about, the companies that have those good relationships with various parts of the business, not just one executive, but someone from the technology function, someone from the compliance function, someone from each different business unit who's able to bring those players together to say, there's something here that we could do that creates a compelling new opportunity to reduce cost, to reduce risk, or to improve the value we deliver to our customers. That's a winning recipe. And I think what we're seeing more and more is there is sort of a segmentation. There's a class of startups that are emerging that have built really powerful, really strong relationships. And with the rise of banks, corporate VCs, coming full circle again. Corporate VCs on average have a lifespan of 2 years, just for everyone in the room here. And so we're seeing a lot of corporate VC money moving into these startups. Companies are direct investing. For us, the biggest sign of confidence is someone saying, not only are we going to build technology together with you on your platform, leveraging your insights and expertise, we're actually going to take our money and invest it in you because we believe that you're going to be successful in doing this not only for us, but for everyone else like us.
And so would you say that that's a good way for startups to work with some of these companies that they might actually disrupt? A user question came in about how do I partner with somebody like Western Union who I might disrupt?
And I think there it's a tenuous balance, as we touched on before. But I think the important message is institutions realize that they're going to be disrupted. And blockchain's not the first time this has happened, right? Every day there's a CB Insights article or a TechCrunch article that says, oh, peer-to-peer is going to totally disrupt the insurance space. Blockchain's going to disrupt financial services. It was AI before, There are these waves that we go through. And at the end of the day, the institution's there for a reason, because it's the best bearer of a particular risk, right? And so the role of institutions may change structurally, but fundamentally, I think, at least in the near future and probably the next 10 to 20 years, these large institutions have a role to play, and they're there for a reason. And so to the startup, I would say the balance of learning how to work within that construct. You can innovate around the edges, but it's very much a sequential shift where, as Scott said earlier, people are learning. They're just starting to understand what this is. And Bitcoin is in year 7, right? The Bitcoin blockchain is in year 7. That technology is still going through the biggest open source development project ever. So in the meantime, I think we all just have to sit back, try different approaches, but we shouldn't dismiss the institution as not being able to innovate, because they're aware of changes coming.
Melton, do you have advice for startups? Because there are a lot of corporate strategic money that's coming into play right now in blockchain technology. Do you have advice for startups as to which route they should go? Is there a difference between being a venture-backed startup versus a strategic-backed startup?
I would say yes. If you take money from a corporation and you're building a POC with them, or you're moving something into production with them, just think about how that's going to shape your perspective and how that's going to shape the journey your product is going to go on. Because by choosing one door, you may be closing
another door.
Many others.
Yeah, but at the same time, I would say they would bring the industry expertise that you might not have as a technology company, right? So if you want to make it real, which is the theme of the event today, you need both. You need the industry expertise and you need the technology expertise. And if you have just one of them, that I don't think you can make it happen. I think you need both. And partnering for us is very important, because when we partner with companies, we actually look at both. We look at technology companies that can complement our integration capabilities, but most importantly to me, the industry expertise that we have for every single business process.
So the corporate money can bring in the industry expertise, is what you're saying?
Well, I think you should not accept the money if they don't bring the expertise as well.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's ultimately, it's up to the founder and the team, right? It's your vision, and there is a big part of this that is ideological for people. It's people who fundamentally believe that this technology brings about an opportunity to change the way that things in our world work, in our financial system. And so for teams and founders who are ideologically really attracted by that mission, maybe they want to go a different path and see, can we build something outside the existing financial system? So it's very much up to the psychology of that team and what your vision is ultimately.
So we're already a few minutes over, but I've saved the best question for last. A user wrote in and said, Amazon has been pretty quiet about blockchain, but we have a little announcement today. Scott, do you want to talk about it?
No.
No.
Oh. My article went out.
Can't talk about it.
Okay. Well, just read my article online.
I will say
With
that. I will say that Amazon is a very customer-centric organization, and we are constantly listening to what our enterprise customers tell us, as well as our blockchain provider customers, and very attentively. And I think you will, if you look at us as an organization, and if you interact with us as an organization, you will know that is our focus, is on our customers and delivering value for them. And I think that will continue to be our focus, whether it's in blockchain or in any other thing that we do. We will remain focused on making sure that our customers' needs are met.
Okay, well, check out my Forbes page for more information. Anyway, well, thank you so much for attending, and that's what I thought.